there's this thing called the erotic blueprints. And it's something that I very commonly refer people to when they're like first getting into being a bit more intentional with their intimacy. And so they're like the love languages, but for sex. And so there's kinky, energetic, sexual, sensual, and shapeshifter.
Thanks for being here, brother.
Glad to have you, man. This is great. Stoked.
Yeah, so it was our mutual friend, Sean McDevitt, that said, hey, you got to reach out to Jordan. And actually, my last guest on the podcast was Scott Holiday.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I've not released that one yet. That's going to be coming out this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
But I know he was recently at one of your events, right?
I was literally just with him yesterday. Yeah, he's been to multiple events. Great guy. Love that guy.
Yeah, beautiful. Can you give us a little overview of what it is that you do, first of all?
Yeah, this is always a fun question to answer. I love to play basketball. Little pattern interrupts. Like, what do you do? I play basketball. I love dogs. My blue-nosed pit bull sitting by my legs right now. Had him for 12 years. He's like my firstborn dog son. I love that thing so much. But as far as, what I do professionally, my wife and I have a sex, love, and relationships business. So, all the things that come with that: online DIY programs, in-person retreats, one-on-one coaching, group stuff. And I support primarily men. She supports primarily women, and then together couples. And it's funny because I hesitate, especially nowadays, to say sex, love, and relationships, because that's a lot of people find us through that. But really, what I support people with is not like, how do you put your P in the V, or like,
how do you do that?
I know. I'm still trying to figure it out. And, and sometimes there is some of that more technical stuff, but the vast majority of what we do is get people into their hearts, into their bodies, get them to speak with conviction and use empowered language and that kind of stuff. And so my work with men is very much centered around that. And it's awesome. My style, my approach is very much sincere, but not overly serious. It's very playful and authentic. So yeah, that's a nice little snapshot.
It feels like that playful element is actually something that can really get overlooked when people go on this journey, which, largely is around either self-discovery, self-exploration, and trying to become either a better version of themselves or a more complete version of themselves, or whatever you want to call it. It can get really serious. And I think that playfulness is really important because it feels like that's really what we want to return to. Some of that childlike playfulness that we once embodied that we then forgot.
So agree, man. And for me, it's like, if I'm not having fun most of my life, then what the fuck is it for? I want to feel joy. I want to be joyful the vast majority of the time. That's not to say that I'm a, bliss bunny, because not everything is rainbows and butterflies. And when I get around those kind of people, I'm like, you actually don't seem like a real person. It feels kind of fake. It feels like bypassing. So there's definitely a balance, but yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah, for sure. Is that element of fun something you've always embodied, or is it something that you also kind of strayed away from at one point and had to return to?
Dude, I'd say I've always been that way. In my group of friends, certainly currently and throughout my life, I've been known as kind of the funny guy, the playful guy. Will do stupid shit for a laugh. We'll also do courageous stuff to just like entertain and inspire. I was in a fraternity in college, and I was very much involved in that in noteworthy front-facing capacities. And yet I could certainly get into some of the childhood, maybe shadow reasons of why I developed that. It's like I moved around a lot. I was typically the poor kid throughout my life. And, I live in America, so it ain't that bad. And yet I was somewhere between like lower middle class and poor. So like kind of in that like lower range. And in order to feel normal and like I belonged and included in things, I oftentimes leveraged humor and playfulness to be seen to be acknowledged and to, again, be included. So yeah, all that to say, I've definitely had it throughout my life, and I have used it sometimes as a crutch, speaking to the childhood reasons for some of why it developed. And so my work in the more recent years, especially since finding my queen, being married, on the way to fatherhood, it's I'm recognizing the times when I will default to humor to bypass authenticity, and like maybe whatever fun, comfortable feelings come up, of sitting in the fire of like, no, this is real. This moment, this conversation requires me to be sincere, authentic, grounded, masculine, not a fucking little boy, you know? So
Yeah, it's great awareness, because and that is where it gets a little more nuanced, doesn't it? Because on one
definitely.
side, what we said before, like, is very valid, which is a lot of people can actually bypass the fun and the humor and the joy and forgetting what, kind of a large part of the journey should involve. But also, yeah, I guess it can show up as something to actually deflect some of the things that actually we might need to dive into that is a little heavier, or sometimes we've got to face the things, like you said, that masculine energy and show up as the man. So yeah, it's interesting how both are true. And actually we have to be able to hold both and look at it in a more nuanced way and understand that, yeah, it's actually there's more depth to it, isn't there? So the work you do with men, specifically, I had a little kind of obviously I had a look at the things that you do in a professional manner, and I'd actually like to also get into some of the things that you do in a non-professional manner. But um, I'm guessing though a lot of the things that you do in a professional manner, it's a lot of people that I have on the podcast. It seems as though they've arrived there, not because when they were at school and they were asked, well, what do you want to do? It's like, I want to be, a sex and relationship coach. I mean, that's not usually the answer. So I imagine most people arrive at this place because it's deeply meaningful and something that they're largely passionate around, which is nice, which is why it's nice to talk about what it is that
Mhm.
you quote unquote do.
Yeah.
Um, what got you to this point of doing this? Because normally there's a story of a journey that
Yeah.
led people, like you and I and a lot of people that I have on the podcast, to the place where they are.
Yeah. Let's see. I typically like to start the story from college. I referenced I was in a fraternity. That was a huge part of my young adult transition, and plenty of stereotypes and judgments around fraternities for a reason. There's truth in stereotypes. And yet I definitely got a lot of the beautiful brotherhood initiation ritual elements. Those stuck with me. And so did some of the shadow, and I got to work through that. But on the other side of that experience, I found myself jumping into the corporate world, being a big boy, sitting in front of a desk, showing up at 7:30 a.m. sharp and having meetings all days and answering emails. And I was like, man, this is not it. Please tell me this is. And I just knew this is not what I'm supposed to do. And I was grateful that it could have been a worse setup. And yet I knew there was more. And so I read my first book for leisure at, I guess I was probably 24, 23, 24. And it was the 4 Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, which I know a lot of people, I think that had an impact on their early journey. And that kind of detonated a bomb that was like, oh, yeah, there is this other way. And here's some notes of what that could look like. And so from there, I negotiated a remote working situation with that company at the time, sold everything I owned, and started living out of my car with my pit bull. And that was like really the start of my hero's journey, where I just said, okay, like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm doing something. And it feels scary, but it feels right. And from there, the next big shift was I found a company called Bulletproof. So a lot of people are probably familiar with Bulletproof coffee. That's what I was taking a sip of at the beginning of this episode. And that was in the early startup days. This is 10 plus years ago now. And I got really into the brand, into the nutrition, biohacking, performance, keto, all that kind of stuff. And they only had like a couple employees at the time. I made a funny 5-minute video of why they should hire me and spliced it all up. And this was like my first really big, creative, courageous, putting myself out there kind of experience, or not my first, but a significant one. And they hired me from there. And I was like, oh shit. It validated that if I put myself out there and I really leverage my gifts, they will be seen. I won't always get what I want, but I might get things that I'd be surprised and I otherwise wouldn't if I didn't go for it. And so I was with that company for like 6.5 years. And I mean, I traveled all over the country, even some international. I was the chief bulletproof bro, as I like to call myself. I was the national educator or national edutainer, as I like to say. And I was really like the evangelist for this movement. And from there, then it was like I naturally started finding myself going to a lot of personal development retreats and going to men's retreats and to festivals and to health conferences and things like that. And suddenly I became the guy amongst my community, amongst my friends, that was, the first person they'd reach out to if they were having a tough time, if they wanted to have like a radically sincere, vulnerable conversation. I was kind of that guy. And simultaneously, at times, I was the brunt of jokes. So it was like, oh, look at Jordan. He's doing weird. He's talking about not masturbating for 30 days on his Facebook. That's fucking weird, stuff like that. And then eventually it was like I had a mentor who really showed me and just imparted this belief that what comes easiest demands the most value. And so for me, what came easiest was supporting people and their growth, as I like to say. So like bro growth. I like to make words up like that. And I was like, all right, cool. Like, man, my dream job would be to make a business out of this. And so many iterations over the years thereafter. And then the next kind of big mile marker was meeting my wife. And this was about 5.5 years ago now. She was a sex coach. It was equal parts intriguing and terrifying. It's like, whoa, this hot, tatted up chick talking about sex. Okay, I see you. And it was very confronting because while I'd been balls deep in personal development, pun intended, I had not really gone into explicitly my sexual personal development, which is its own game. And I found that a lot of my general personal development had not transferred over into the sexual space as much as one might expect or hope. But the other way around, once I started to get lube it up in that regard, in the sexual space and tantra and bioenergetics and some of that kind of stuff, then I was like, oh, now this is actually transferring to my entire life. And so then over the course of the last 5 years, really on that journey with myself, with my wife, and that's just naturally been integrated into who I'll be, what I do, and what I support people with.
Incredible, man. There's a few things I want to unpack there. First of all, you said about putting yourself out there and offering your gifts. Did you clearly know what your gifts were at that point for that stage of your life?
Yeah. Yes, but I had this fun conscious story. There's another one of my words that my gifts were like sort of altruistic, they didn't require monetary exchange. It's like, oh, like I'm a shoulder to lean on. I can give like really good advice. I can do all these things, but that's not a job, or that's not something. In fact, I thought it was wrong to receive money for that. I was like, oh no, that's like, ew, that like taints the gift and all those kind of things. So I had the knowing, and it continued to reveal itself more and more. And I still worked through that story at times. But it wasn't even in my awareness that could be something that would be part of my business, like / the core of my business. So yeah, all that to say, I was definitely aware of that stuff pretty early on. I'd say especially as I got into the fraternity experience and was starting to run for like leadership positions, where I was like, one of them was I was the social chair, which is they call it like VP of External Affairs. And I'll never forget the first time I went in front of a group of 100 gorgeous sorority girls, just me, and had to give like a speech and to be like entertaining and to get them excited about this theme party that we were throwing. It was like once I did that and I was like, oh, I'm like good at this, then my confidence started to just like continue to grow and morph and shift over the years.
The gift of being that shoulder to lean on.
Huh.
Is that something that you just naturally had, or did that come out of any experiences that you had earlier in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I would say both nature and nurture. But speaking to the nurture piece, I I grew up. I was born into a Christian family. My grandparents were actually pastors of a charismatic church in Southern California called Powerhouse Christian Fellowship. I'm talking like extremely expressive, like speaking in tongues, holy laughter, uh, just slain in the spirit, all that kind of stuff. And so I was born into that. But then my parents got divorced when I was like 2.5, 3. So I don't even really remember those early years. And I moved to Ohio with my mom. And suddenly I had like two very different lives. I would spend summers with my dad back in California. And that setting was very much that Christian religious setup, going to church every Sunday and sometimes other days, forced to read the Bible. My dad is a Christian evangelist through and through. Like to this very day, he's trying to convert me to Jesus Christ. He's trying to save me. And yet, so I had that, in the summers, but the rest of the time, the other 9 months of the year in school and all that, I was in a small town in Ohio. It was more of that kind of rugged, again, a little bit on the poorer side. And my house was where all the firsts happened. So the first time you smoked weed, the first time you drank beer, the first time you got a hand job, your dick sucked, like whatever it was, my house is often the first for that. 'Cause my mom was
Can
single
I come
mom,
over?
worked at a bar. What's that?
Can I come over?
Yes, you may. People knew. People knew. So again, had kind of those two different worlds. And then in high school, I moved back to California, and my mom and I moved in with my grandparents, her parents, that were pastors of that church. So you can see that I had this duality of sorts, this range, and I had to become a chameleon. I really had to adapt to all these different situations. And I also felt like I kind of needed to be the good boy, the golden boy, because my older brother was the one that got in trouble. My older sister was kind of a little bit that way too. And I developed this, I'll call it obsession with being liked. I was like desperate to be liked. And in many ways, it served me really well because people felt comfortable with me. They felt special in my presence. And that's been, a gift throughout my life. And yet that sometimes desperation to be liked has had me be a people pleaser, the nice guy that's overly accessible and that, allows my energy to be kind of sucked on when I don't actually want that. And I even, in a sense, make people thieves of my energy because I sometimes show up in that way. And that's really on me. So in more recent years, I've become much more aware of like, okay, would I rather be liked by many or loved by few? And that's a good recalibration metric for me. But again, all that to say, kind of the jumping around, I lived with many different relatives throughout high school, aunts, uncles, like I said, grandparents. I even lived with like friends' parents. And so that had me always have this awareness in the back of my mind. I don't want to overstay my welcome. I want people to be excited to be in my presence. I want them to feel comfortable and like they can share and all these kind of things. That's, a synopsis of the nurturing piece of that.
You mentioned the duality of having the kind of Christian family and the experiences in Ohio and how that was. Do you think that really kind of like allowed you to be more open-minded to people and perspectives and viewpoints in general?
No question. Like that was a big gift. And I think so in my current friend group here, like I have this squad, I call it the Conscious Couples Coalition or the Pleasure Posse. We have like all kinds of funny names for us. It's 5 couples. And a value that we all really share is this idea of range. And that's why I love these people and I'm so all in with them as like my soul fam for life, because one of the biggest reasons is this range. We can, the guys can be idiots, be politically incorrect, crack crispy boys and play games and compete and talk shit. And yet we can have the most fun, comfortable, important, beautiful, deep conversations where we just like pour our hearts out. And that range, again, was, I think, very much influenced by my upbringing. And I am so grateful for that. It's one of my favorite qualities / my favorite quality in people.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. And then you mentioned about being a people pleaser.
Mhm.
How did that show up for you in relationships? Because I feel like this is a nice segue into some of the relationship stuff.
Yeah. What first comes to mind is a book called No More Mr. Nice Guy. Have you heard of this book by any chance?
Yeah, but I've not read it.
It's so good. And it doesn't resonate with every man, but I think most men that it has some golden nuggets within it. And I would say a good chunk of men are like, holy shit, this is me. And one of the core concepts in the book is this idea of being a people pleaser or being a nice guy is another way to say it. And it's society has glorified men being really agreeable and nice and uh, essentially doing whatever anybody wants of them at the expense of being really solid, trustworthy, high integrity men, being real people. And so, yeah, the people pleaser thing is, I think, a plague of the masses. And I would say, in particular, for men, it's certainly women too, just shows up differently, I suppose. So, yeah, it's, I would historically avoid conflict and confrontation at all costs because I had this idea that being nice, that didn't fit into being nice. When actually, it's the nicest thing to be real with someone. And it also reminds me of the idea of love. Love is not always rainbows and butterflies. It sometimes is fun conditional love. It's like, ooh, if I really want to love you at the highest level, I got to break this bone fully and reset it as opposed to putting a band aid on that bullet wound and just bleeding out over time. And so that's a lesson I've definitely learned the hard way, so to speak, but it's a valuable lesson that I continue to learn at higher and higher levels.
Yeah, and again, it kind of points to the nuance within the idea of being nice. Because nice, it's nice to be nice,
Right?
right? But there's actually the shadow of nice, which is I abandon my boundaries. I don't
Yep.
value my sense of self or my own needs. And people can abandon that. And that's really the shadow of being nice, where actually I put everyone else before me and and possibly to my detriment.
Yep. Yeah. So agree. Yeah. And in relationships, especially, man, the past, I feel like this season, I've been in a season of shooting people straight and having really radical, again, fun, comfortable conversations. And I'm starting to realize that that is one of the most important loving things I can do for anyone, and especially for men. I want to, in my opinion, how I approach men is very different than I'll approach a woman in this kind of conversation and like really addressing slash superseding the people pleaser stuff. And I mean, I even think of like a few situations in my past where I didn't share something with someone because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I wanted to be a nice guy, be a people pleaser. And then that person suffers because they didn't get that radical feedback and have, I wasn't willing, courageous enough to be that mirror, like, hey, there's this thing I'm noticing. And obviously there's such an important nuanced way to approach those kind of conversations where I maintain their dignity and I'm also not like projecting and shooting on them and like you are this or you are that. It's like that's the dance of language too, because I've heard it said when I speak, I'm praying and I'm casting spells. So I want to be very mindful of what I'm praying and whatever spells I'm casting. But nonetheless, I think that is one of the major antidotes in society right now is in particular courageous men being willing to hurt people's feelings, not because not coming from an egoic place or even that I need to fix you. It's that I love you and I care about you. I care about humanity. I care about the people in my world. And so I'm willing to have you not like me, to maybe even hurt your feelings and perhaps even like ruin our relationship because the North Star that I'm looking to is I love you and I hold this vision for the highest expression of you. And I want all the people around me to be aware of that and to be looking to that ideal because that's what I'm doing for myself. And that's important.
I think maybe the bit that makes people feel uncomfortable about that honest truth, and like you said, being willing to hurt someone's feelings. I think very often growing up, the reference we have for our feelings being hurt often can be through malintent or through like a malicious behavior.
Yeah.
So I think we actually then hold the idea of hurting someone's feelings as a malicious thing to do. But to your point, when actually, no, it's deeply rooted in love. So you can access that highest expression of who you are. And of course, the intention isn't to hurt the feelings. The intention is to offer that truth to allow for growth. It's different. And I think there might be a lot of people that listen to these types of podcasts because this is a podcast of like inner growth, introspection, spiritual growth. And a lot of those people are very often kind, benevolent people. And with those characteristics, the idea of being honest enough to hurt someone's feelings can make them feel uncomfortable. So I think it's actually an important thing to understand that when it's deeply rooted in love, it's a beautiful gift that you can offer to someone, especially if it's not coming from judgment. That
Yeah.
feeling of non-judgment and actually, no, like brother, sister, I'm saying this really out of love. And when they can feel that, I actually think it's a beautiful gift to offer.
I'm so with you, man. It reminds me of the book Radical Honesty. Have you ever read that book by any chance?
I don't know.
Dude, it's definitely the core, like top 5 that I would recommend as far as personal development. And again, especially for men, it's make no mistake, this book is radical, and the author, Brad Blanton, I don't necessarily resonate and agree with everything, but I think it's an experiment that's worth considering, and it has medicine for everyone. And the way I like to interpret it, this idea of radical honesty, he really speaks to being forthright. He argues that society is largely dishonest to the extent that they aren't forthright with how they feel. And I know that for me, before I was exposed to this, I was like, oh yeah, I'm an honest guy. And then when he framed it like, but are you forthright? I was like, oh no, I withhold all the time. And so he is of the mind, like, stop withholding, like share. Mental transparency is kind of how I interpret the extreme of that. I like to fall somewhere in the middle of that pendulum, and I call it grounded authenticity, where it's like I'm grounded in that love and my trustworthiness, and I'm authentic. It's like, this is how I really feel. This is what I'm really seeing. I'm not just mentally, spewing out all over you whatever weird shit I think. Because I don't know about you, but I think weird, absurd stuff sometimes, and stuff that's just like totally inappropriate to say. And I think another way to look at it is being proactive versus reactive. You talked about the malicious kind of energy. Oftentimes that comes from a place of emotional reactivity instead of like that proactive, like, I've thought about this, I've been patient with it, and I'm coming from this place of grounded love.
Yeah, I think what you said about the radical honesty and being forthright, I think it's a case of balancing that out with social acuity as well.
That's
Having
good.
a level of acuity to say like, okay, like there is being forthright, yes, but if you're at your wife's family's house for Christmas dinner and they were like, what did you get up to last night? And you're like, well, I fought like a madman for an hour straight.
That's a great example.
Okay, that's radically honest, but maybe it's not appropriate. That lacks a little acuity.
Yep, totally agree.
So sharing that at your wife's family's house might not be the most appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, agree. And like, I like to think of social masks. There's this idea of masks, and sometimes it can have a negative connotation, understandably so. It's like, oh, I'm wearing a mask, I'm not being who I actually am. And yet, I like to play with masks in certain situations. When I'm with my wife's family and with my in-laws, yeah, I'm going to act a little differently, not at the expense of being inauthentic or being someone who I'm not, but I'm wearing the mask. When I'm around my grandparents who are pastors, I'll also wear a bit of a mask. And yet, especially as I just get older and wiser, I suppose, I'm willing to take off a little bit of the mask and be a little bit more of who I truly am in that moment, at the risk of maybe going a little too far. That's my personal work, because I've had the tendency to be on the other side of that, of not going far enough, and then feeling like, I bypassed my authenticity in that moment. And so like a great representation of that is how I talk with my dad. My dad being that Christian evangelist, I've had some of the most beautiful conversations with him over the past few years, just being much more like radical with sharing who I am and how I perceive him and some like blind spots and those kinds of things. And because he's willing to go there and he's open, we are just that much closer. And that feels so beautiful.
Yeah, that's great, man. That is great. What you said then about masks, I think it's interesting because I think about that, and what comes up for me is that sometimes the authentic self actually can be a mask that we've just worn for the longest time.
I like it.
And really, if you think about it, if my personal belief is that we are from the one consciousness that became two, that became many, and within every single one of us is actually the potential for the entire spectrum of human emotion, of human behavior, of absolutely all of it. And I feel like it's all in there, in me, all the time. And something I've really been thinking about recently is how much people don't want to see the darkness that's within them. And I actually believe that to the extent that you can see the darkness within you, allows you to understand the darkness around you, but I think it also allows you to see the light in you. And then you realize you have the choice to choose, like, which do I want to be? And I've done, like, one time I had some DMT and I didn't go all the way to breakthrough. So I was like, it was almost more like the ayahuasca kind of level of experience rather than the full blast off DMT, straight DMT style. And I was shown this demon or this devil. And at first I was like, oh, I don't want to see it. And then I felt like, no, I need to. And I took a look and I was like, oh, what is that? And it just said, this is in you.
Ooh.
I was like, oof. And then it showed me this like angelic figure. And it said, this is also in you. And you need to look deeply at both and decide how you want to show up.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And I really kind of feel like, that idea of, when we are in these different social settings, for me, I actually just think all of it's there in me all the time. What's the appropriate part of me to kind of access right now and to show up in a way that is authentic in my expression, but it's like, and I kind of feel like that actually, it stops me from pigeonholing myself of who I think I need to be or who I am. And actually, no, I want to see the entirety of who I am.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, so much comes up for me when you describe that. That was beautiful. I think of Jordan Peterson, his teachings around the how people can do really gnarly things. Like we've seen it throughout history, and I think it's an important thought experiment to consider. If I were born at a different time, at a different place, what would I be capable of? And it's like that spectrum is within all of us, like you spoke to. I'm so, yeah, and that's confronting. It's like, well, no, like I love to read like biographies, especially of the founding fathers of America and stuff like that. And I'm reading one right now by Abraham Lincoln and his rise to being president during the Civil War and the slavery conversation. And I think it's really important to be like, if I had been alive then, I might have been totally with the culture of the time that said slavery is like, yeah, well, this is what's supposed to happen. Or at the very least, I might have been an abolitionist that said, yeah, we need to get rid of slavery, and yet blacks are not equal to me, because that was still the foundational belief. And we think about that today, and I'm like, no way. Like, I'm way too nice for that. It's like, no, people can do like outside environment and influences combined with what is capable within me. Whoo, there's a recipe there that creates someone like Adolf Hitler potentially,
For sure, man, for sure. And also, on that, it's realizing that anyone who thinks the progressive today in 100 years' time might be far right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And maybe not even 100 years' time, maybe 20 years' time, maybe 10 years' time.
Yeah.
I think that's important. But yeah, I think being able to see, like, to actually know what you're capable of. And I think a lot of people, if they aren't willing to see that, or if they say, no, I could never do that, I'm not sure how much I trust them.
Totally. I'm with you. Yeah.
I've said this for a long time. I know that in me, I feel so much love and care for people, and I always have done. And I've always been confused that on the other hand, I know there is a fucking savage inside of
Monster.
me. I know it's there.
Uh-huh.
I see. I not only do I see it, I had to, like, when I was younger, my temper was awful. Like when I was kind of, growing up. But again, on the other side, I was almost like Jekyll and Hyde. Like I was always really loving and caring and sweet, but it's like there was a switch also where I could go to the absolute other end of the spectrum. And maybe part of that was maybe a little nature nurture. Like I'm half Arabic, and the entire Arabic side of my family are like explosive. And I grew up around a lot of explosiveness. So maybe there's a little in the genes. Maybe there's a little from the experience of what I grew up around. But I see it though. I see it, and actually, it's only I believe to the depth that you can see it that you can go, okay, like I know it's there, and because I know it's there, I can handle it. I can deal with it, and to me, and whilst I'm not a Christian, I do love some of I'll sit and think very philosophically about some of the things that Jesus said. And I'll think, what did he really mean? That might, like, the point's being missed here. What did he really mean? And I'll think about even the idea of going to the wilderness to face the devil. And I'll think about, we all have a time in our lives, and actually it can happen on a macro and a micro scale, but we all enter a wilderness where the devil shows up for us. And I believe that devil is within. And it's that darkness that, we were just speaking to. And I think the more you know yourself, you can know, okay, in these scenarios, that is when I enter the wilderness. That is when the devil shows up for me. And the more I know that, the more I can be prepared for it.
Yeah.
The more I can be ready and like, okay, I know in certain scenarios, and that may be that, it might be a triggered response, but it also might be, I don't know, like when not so much for me now, but definitely sometime before, it would be when I go to a bar, part of my shadow was I would immediately just want to take a woman home.
Yep. Same.
And I've spoke about that in different, episodes of things that I've kind of like had to, I guess, overcome, because that was a thing that I really kind of rooted some of my identity in, which served as a way of giving me validation for really how low and little I actually thought of myself. But now, and I don't go to bars very often, but if I do, I actually am aware that there's almost this autopilot response to have a little glance around, and I can actually feel it's still there, but I know, one, I don't want to show up like that. Two, it can't ever really offer me anything that is real. And so I don't engage in it. But I'm still aware there's that little kind of like, hey, that little whisper. I'm like, I hear you. No.
Yeah. So to follow that thread a little bit, when you're talking earlier about the masks and the mask of authenticity is kind of how I interpret it. This is bringing up a season for me when I call this my conscious fuckboy season. When I was like, I came up with this phrase. I don't know if I came up with it, but I thought I did. Anti-game is the best game. I started being so authentic with women. And I would like ask them questions. I would share vulnerably. And then I started to realize, oh, this is a really good anti-game game tactic. And I was so clever at convincing myself that this was beautiful, this was good, this was right. And to be fair, I don't think that it was bad or wrong. It was like better than how I was showing up before. And I was, even in hindsight, I'm really mostly proud of how I showed up with and for women and like took care of them and was just all those kind of things. And yet when I graduated, if you were, matured beyond that, I was like, oh, I have this power that I'm wielding, and I'm actually not being the most conscious steward of it. Because like, and here's kind of a bit more of a specific example. I would start dating or go on a date or connecting with a woman or women, and was, juggling, spinning the plates of many women, being the traveling sales guy. And I would convince myself, I would, be radically honest. And I would say, hey, something along the lines of like, I'm not interested in getting any kind of relationship. I like you. I like spending time, blah, blah, blah. And they'd say, oh, yeah, cool. Like, I'm totally good with that. And what I was reading was not that was not true. Whether they consciously believe that or not didn't necessarily matter. My internal compass, my ruthless integrity within was telling me is, and it started to just get louder and louder and more, and the dissonance got stronger and stronger of like, I'm acting out of integrity. I am very cleverly taking advantage of women. And that was like the more subtle demon within me that I was like, oh, like I get to move beyond this. And no sooner did I do that, I had one woman that I was dating who was, it was so funny. It was just like this beautiful, like universe God wink of like bringing this situation to me. It's like, oh, so you're serious about moving through this thing. Okay, let me show you this. It was a woman who was gorgeous. And I was like so chemically attracted to her, and she was so sweet, and she actually even embodied a lot of characteristics that were what I told myself I thought I wanted in like a long-term partner, especially because I had gotten out of a relationship before that was more of like the power couple, strong woman, entrepreneur. And it was, both of our dicks were out oftentimes. And so there was just like this masculine contest.
Whose was the biggest?
I know exactly. Hers would just dwarf mine oftentimes. And so I was like, all right, I want the opposite. I want a super feminine woman, and, yada, yada, yada. And so the universe provided. And essentially instantly I knew, I was like, oh, this isn't actually what I want, but damn, she's hot. And like, it feels really good and nourishing to be in her presence. Like, I really want to sleep with her and all that kind of stuff. And it was the first time that I had the opportunity to sleep with a woman that I was very attracted to. And I had checked all the boxes of being, forthright, more or less, with how I felt. And yet she still was ready, willing, and able to go there. And I actually cut it off and said no. After like, and I was doing the dance for about a month or two. And I was like, all right, no, I officially got to cut this off. And within like a month and a half, I met my now wife. It was like, okay, yep, you're ready. Let's go on to the next journey.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's great. And I resonate with that. I mean, I came out of a relationship. It's weird, really. It was probably the very start of this year, but it was, and I've never actually been in, whenever I've finished relationships previously, it's always been quite definitive and with closure, and we get it, and on we go. And this one was kind of like, I struggled with that. And it seemed more like, if I'm honest, it was like, I kind of wanted more of the definitive closure to do with love and respect and honor and thanks. And then I think she found that hard and want to kind of like just like reconnect and at times at least. And so coming out of that breakup, I could feel myself twitching and still to kind of want to go back on the dating apps and just to kind of go and get that fix and I don't want to do it because actually I was single for 5 years before my most recent relationship, and the relationship before that was with my daughter's mum. But I've been single for 5 years. But actually, I wasn't. I might have not been in a relationship, but I definitely wasn't single. And again, I've spoken about it on previous episodes, but I was really quite prolific in the amount of people that I would date, and it was like a thing that I know I've moved beyond now, But again, you know, that kind of, there is that whisper of like, hey, just get back on the dating apps. Like, this is a good idea. And I know what that looks like for me. And actually, so now I'm in a space where I'm like, no, I'm actually being single, which means being with me, going deeper into the relationship with me, being with myself and feeling comfort in that.
Mhm.
And but again, you know, like the stuff still comes up. I still hear, and even today, I was like, shall I download Hinge?
Yep. Yeah.
And
It's there, and to maybe even zoom out a little bit, it a lot of the work I did that had a profound impact on my life is bioenergetics, and a lot of like the Osho teachings. If you're familiar with Osho, a lot of controversy around who he was, but a master of sorts, a guru. And I found that the whole premise of like bioenergetics and some of the Osho teachings is repression. Is like the masses are highly repressed, and sexually being probably more than anywhere. Just like the taboo nature of it. Don't talk about it. Don't show it. It's inappropriate. The practice of circumcision, like I'm circumcised, like sexual trauma, from being an infant, and just so many variations thereof. And it's like, okay, well, if I have these pressures to not express, then okay, I'm going to repress it. I'm going to like shove it down. And then it becomes this whole suppressed, in the subconscious nervous system, the issues in the tissues, neuromuscular armoring, all this stuff throughout the body. It's like, well, fuck, at worst, dis-ease or disease, or even just like passive aggressiveness or inauthenticity or all these kinds of things, or people pleaser, nice guy, all that kind of stuff. And I don't think that just because I repress something doesn't mean it just goes away. In fact, it probably just festers and then manifests in different ways and that are equally not as good, but might just feel or seem a little more acceptable or whatever. So I found for me that one of the several practices that have helped me, and again, I speak to men often, so I say especially for men, is like breath work. It's catharsis. It's competing in like athletics, like that brotherhood competition kind of stuff where I'm like getting to collaborate while also like fucking exercising my body, literally like lifting weights, running, all that kind of stuff. And and I look around and see a society that is largely overweight, unhealthy, obese, and like disease at an all-time high, yada yada yada. It's like, okay, maybe we go back to the basics by just like pushing around some weights, getting outside, walking around, playing with each other, getting into our bodies. And a lot of people are talking about this kind of stuff, and I think for good reason.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. You know, I was thinking this the other day that most of the things that we have in place now as a measure of what to do is actually just a response to how out of alignment we are. For example, checking, did I do my 10,000 steps? The only reason you need to check is because we're so conditioned to sit at a fucking desk or on the sofa or in the car. Or like, did I drink enough water? And again, like at one time, you would never have to consider if you've had
Yep.
enough water. It would just happen naturally. We're just so far out of being in alignment with how we're meant to be that we now have to come up with like, like a whoop strap to know, like, did you do enough things today?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm so with you, man. Yeah, the water one. It's funny you said that because I heard someone say that the other day, and it just like so clicked of how the hilarity of that. So somebody asked, actually, I think it was Dave Asprey, founder of Bulletproof, and I saw like a little clip he did. I was like, "How much water should you drink?" He's like, "However much your body tells you. Drink when you're thirsty. Simple as that." This idea of like 10,000 steps or drink a gallon of water or whatever. Yeah, like you said, it's even our grandparents or certainly great grandparents would be like, "What? Huh? Drink water when you're thirsty. Just walk and be a normal human being." But it's, we live in a relatively abnormal world. Like everything I'm looking at right now, I'm in a house, I'm looking at this box. It's like everything's natural, and yet there's nothing here that is like untouched natural, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. John Churchill.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, I came across him last year on Aubrey Marcus's podcast. He was like one of Aubrey's favorite guests of last year. And, like I was overjoyed that he joined me a few weeks ago on the podcast. And one of the things that he was saying was that it's the disparity. There's a gap between the technology that we have now and that we have available to us and our ability to evolve to be able to actually use it. And I think that's very much the case. It's like there's all of this change that's happened around us within technology and how we live. And the human body and evolution happens very slowly.
Yep. What's that quote? I want to say it's E.E. Cummings. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. That is such a dense quote. Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, godlike technologies. That is a fucking perfect storm.
Whoa. Yeah, and no wonder we're fucked.
Yeah. And I'm just going to be on this ride, this roller coaster, and put my hands up and like, yeah, okay, rather than like, what else can I do?
Yeah, no, it's true. I think, it is nice though that there's more and more of this. There's more of this conversation. And at one time, I mean, I first got into traditional self-development when I was 14. I started listening to Wayne Dyer. I had a Wayne Dyer cassette album when I was 14. And then, Stephen Covey and Brian Tracy and Deepak Chopra. And it was all like the Nightingale Conant kind of collections. And I'm 35 this week, actually. So I was listening to, been into kind of the personal growth stuff for a long time. And back then, people thought it was weird. Like talking about those types of things, even Tony Robbins, people would be like, look at it like it was witchcraft. and now, if you think about how like normal and mainstream that is, and actually now we're seeing people really starting to embrace plant medicines and like ayahuasca. And I first did ayahuasca 7 years ago, and again then I really very, very few people I could mention that to that would know what it was. And now, whilst there's still a lot of people that don't, there's a heck of a lot that do know what it is.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a tipping point that just continues to build. And so I think that's very inspiring. And certainly the past few years, COVID, craziness of the world, it's like, okay, just the light is being shown on the shadow more and more. And people are just becoming more aware. And it's beautiful. I think it's like super inspiring. And like guys that I'm starting to connect with in my professional capacity that are joining my men's groups or coming to my retreats, it's my favorite thing when a guy who's just a normal like middle American dude has never really talked about his feelings authentically with other men, and he can just do that. And it's normal. It's cool. It's not weird, and it's not over the top even. It's just like, I mean, something as simple as like one of the opening parts of a call sometimes I'll do is, what's rosebud thorn? What was the highlight of your day? What was the low light, shitty part of your day, i.e. the thorn? And what's something that's like budding, that's like unclear, but it's kind of emerging? And responding to that prompt is like a big deal. Or sharing gratitude is like, I don't do that. Like, it's not a cool thing to do in my family, or I've been told, that as a guy, I don't talk about feelings on any level or desires or any of that kind of stuff. So it's like, and once you pop, you can't stop. It's like Pringles. And I see these guys just go harder and harder. And it's like that. Oh, that's so inspiring. And that's the kind of shit that will, as cheesy as it sounds, change the world in a big, big way.
Absolutely, man. And I was just about to say, how important do you think that is for men?
For men in particular, because I think women already naturally do that, like a lot of them do, and some on the spectrum, let's say. Whereas for men, for whatever reason, and there's many reasons, it's been like, no, I don't do that. I think about like my dad's dad, and it's like, I got to be strong, and emotions aren't strong. And I think it's also important, like the balance, like, yes, you do have to be strong. Like, don't over process, because it's something I see oftentimes in the conscious community nowadays is like the airy fairy men who are like they're really very feminine, but they're sharing their feelings and they're tuned in and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, well, I don't want you to be a woman. I want you to still be a man. And there's things about being a man, literal physical strength and the figurative elements of that strength where, yeah, I don't need to mentally masturbate and over process my emotions with everyone all the time. And especially not with my woman, with my wife. And this is like a lesson I just continue to learn is, okay, what do I need to share with her? Like, what are things that are important to share with her because she is my life partner, she's my wife, she's my romantic forever person, and what are things that are like, actually that's my shit to process. I'm going to bring that to my boys, I'm going to bring that to my guys, my trusted advisors, and then maybe I don't even need to ever bring it up to my wife because it's not relevant to her and it doesn't serve the purpose of our container.
I think that, and this actually loops back to what we said before about the radical authenticity and then
Mm-hmm.
versus acuity, and is this appropriate?
Yeah.
Because sometimes there are things that we might know that might be troubling us, and we know that we can handle it, but we want to discuss it. But maybe if we put that onto our partner, maybe that's actually going to weigh really heavy on them, and they'll actually worry about it more than what
Yep.
maybe they need to.
Yep.
And I think sometimes people want their partner to be their everything.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to be my all, my everything. And in ways, they, okay, sure, you're romantic everything,
Mm-hmm.
you're intimate everything, right? But it doesn't have to be like my everything, everything.
Yeah.
Where if I want to go put on some gloves and do some sparring, maybe my lady isn't the person to do that with. Maybe she is for some people, but
Mhm.
also maybe she's not.
Yeah.
And I think actually, yeah, being able to kind of know that your partner doesn't have to wear every single hat for you. And sometimes, yeah, it's you go to the trusted other people, the trusted boys in your life where you kind of process and you talk about it. And maybe for some people in general, they don't have other people in their lives where they can be vulnerable and authentic with. And I think that's the importance of finding groups like this, or tribes or communities, where you can have the conversations.
Yeah. Yep. So agree. And what that brings up for me is you kind of spoke to it basically is like this idea that my partner's my best friend. Like when I when I hear guys say my wife is my best friend, I'm like, oh shit, we got some problems. And I've heard many people say, and like David Data is a big proponent of this stuff, is like your partner's not your therapist. And like my wife and I have a group called Couples Goals, and inevitably this is the way it goes. This is kind of the client journey, if you will, in our business. Is a woman finds my wife, she's that sex chick on Instagram, so they find her, they start following her podcast, all that kind of stuff. They are introduced to me, and then they show their man me like, hey, like check this guy out. They're hesitant, they don't want to be shit on, they don't, who wants to feel like their wife is like criticizing them in some capacity, saying you need to be better, check this guy out. And like there's just so much emasculation potentially, blah blah blah. But eventually, oftentimes they'll kind of get over it and they'll give it a try. They'll get dragged into like our couples program, and then we find out that wow, this couple, they really only have each other. Like really, they don't have neither of them. Sometimes the woman is a little bit better in this regard, but like they don't have guy groups, women groups. They don't have like couples that they are, really doing life with, and kind of the whole village tribe, raising the kids and all that kind of stuff. It's so non-existent for the most part. And it's like, oh, I think society is just starting to comprehend the shortcomings of that, like massively so. And that's really only, I think, been, I don't know, within the past generation or so that nuclear family thing has become so prominent. And a lot of people are waking up like, oh yeah, this is, not only is it not in my best interest, but it's just not, it's lonely. It's not as fun to live this way. The novelty seeking that a lot of people are maybe getting from social media and screens and porn and compulsive masturbation, all that kind of stuff. It's like those quick fixes are they're just not the solution whatsoever. And it's, call me crazy, but I think it's community.
For sure, man, for sure. And think of the pressure that actually puts on a relationship. And not only the pressure it puts on the relationship, but the amount of fear for the relationship to end if it is unhealthy, and if it actually the right move is to end that chapter. But sometimes when that person has been everything, you can end up staying in a really bad relationship as well, that maybe has, kind of ran its time, but it's like, well, I don't have anything outside of this. It just creates a really unhealthy kind of dynamic all the way around.
Yep. I see that with my dad. Funny enough, my dad, who's the Christian evangelist, he's been married to my stepmom for 30 plus years. And it's like not a relationship. There's like a lot of stuff there that I won't get into, but they almost got divorced once. And after a couple years, when they're at like home stretch of the divorce being final, they got back together because they were just lonely. They didn't have any community. And my dad, like ironically enough, he's heavily involved in the church and he does a lot of community service, and but he doesn't have real community, which is like so many people, church is community for them. And yet like the depth of that community, my dad was not actually getting it. And therefore he went back to this absurd marriage where there's no actual real deep love and trust and respect and intimacy and all those kind of things. It's like, cool, I'll take what I can get. I think a lot of people are just in a lot of capacities, relationships and beyond, taking what they can get.
Yeah, for sure, man. What do you think is the biggest kind of what are some of the biggest stumbling blocks people face in relationships from what you've observed, like professionally?
Yeah, it's a great question. So a couple of things come to mind. The first fairly practical, tactical thing is this idea of erotic love languages. So most people are familiar with the love languages, the 5 love languages: physical touch, quality time, gifts, the like. And there's a similar modality for erotic experiencing, for that kind of expression and exchanging sexual energy. And there's certainly some common differences between men and women, but just amongst people, there's a spectrum. And so there's this thing called the erotic blueprints. And it's something that I very commonly refer people to when they're like first getting into being a bit more intentional with their intimacy. And so they're like the love languages, but for sex. And so there's kinky, energetic, sexual, sensual, and shapeshifter. And I would just, for people that are listening, I'd recommend going and checking it out. There's a quiz you can take. There's a free one that's really basic, and then there's like a $17 one. I would recommend taking the $17 one. It's $17 well invested. You get like a nice comprehensive overview of like how you experience eroticism. So I think oftentimes it starts there with just getting language, understanding, and communication around what I want, who I am, how I experience this. So that's one of the most common things that is very much an aha for people when they're having challenges in their intimacy and their sex life. And then from there, I mean, there's so many directions to go. Like, I think novelty is one of the biggest things, right? Like in a long-term relationship, it's like, all right, there's not, if I leave it up to chance, there's not much in the way of novelty that's just going to present itself, few and far between. And so, okay, I can have sex with 1,000 different people the same way and get novelty that way. I used to do that kind of thing. Or, exactly right. Or I can, what I think is the more, call it righteous path, or the way of the superior man, is have sex 1,000 different ways with the same woman and go really for the depth rather than the breadth. And so it's like, okay, well, how do I get to that novelty? What does that even look like? Reading erotic novels is a great place to start. The first time I read an erotic novel, I was like, it just got me into that energy of what like, how can it look from a novelty novel? I didn't even really put that together. There's maybe something there. It made erotic experiencing much more top of mind, and I was just getting ideas. And so I was reading about like dominance and submission. There's this great book called I Am a Dominant. It's great on Audible. And I mean, I was just rock solid the whole time listening to this. It's so fucking hot. And it's this guy who's a dominant. You know, if you're familiar with BDSM, dominant submission, I had tons of judgments in that regard. When I first was exposed to this stuff, I was like, oh, those people are, fucked up in the head, like psychological problems. It's like, maybe some, sure, but probably a lot less than I thought. And so, yeah, starting to just educate myself, read books, be exposed to novels, to, the realm of BDSM and conscious kink and that kind of stuff. It's like, oh, there is novelty, and I can turn, our sexual connection into something that is so much bigger than just, again, the whole P and the V. Just like, all right, cool, yeah, it feels good, climax, and then we're done. Because I think especially for women that gets really old. And so, yeah, I mean, things like blindfolds, even just like a blindfold can be such an easy thing that can make such a fun little difference. Just a great little hack. A massage table. Dude, we got a massage table a few years ago, and it is our like foundational, if you want to call it sex magic ritual kind of asset, where it injects another level of intention and playfulness and sexiness into what otherwise could be pretty mundane. So I could say it much, much more, but I'll leave that there for now.
Yeah, for sure, man. I like that. And it's, I think there's a lot of men that sometimes get a little almost insecure around the idea of like using other things to like bring
Uh-huh.
them to sex life, like, vibrators or toys, or it's like, oh, what am I not enough?
I know, dude. And like lube is a big thing in that regard too. And I'll just say a quick little thing on this, because I think this is so often I tell people this and their minds are fucking blown. And it seems almost like the surface level, like not a big deal, but it actually, it can be deeply emotional when I share this, because I know for me, I had this story. If I am about to have sex with a woman and she's not wet, it's because I didn't get her wet. She's not turned on. She's not as attracted to me as like I want her to be, or she should be. Like I'm, not good enough. All that kind of stuff comes up. No, 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 no. There's so much variability in a woman's cycle within her 30-day cycle of like how lubricated she will or won't be is very much influenced by that. So that's the first big thing, where it literally can just be have nothing to do and everything to do with her in that regard. Then men get aroused 6 to midnight, get a boner, and that can just happen very, very quickly. And anything can stimulate that, potentially the NRBs and no reason boners that you'd get in school, and you'd flip it up in your waistband, and that whole story.
The good old days.
The good old days, exactly. I had an experience like a week ago in that regard, where I was like sitting down and that happened, and I had to get up, and I was like, and I had very loose pants on and no boxers, and I was like, oh man, I feel like I'm in school again. Anyway, for women, the arousal process typically takes a solid 10 to 15 minutes or more. So, especially in a long term relationship, when there's, in a sense, the cards are stacked against you as far as like novelty and just time, maybe there's kids, there's all this kind of stuff. If we're trying to go straight there, and it's not the best time of the month for lubrication, just physiologically, biologically, and we have not taken the time to warm things up so that lubrication is naturally created, then yeah, that's use lubrication. I use lube almost every time we have sex, whether we quote need it or not. It's just it's a support. It's like, cool, let's just make this easy on all of us. And like, get it. You kind of, I was gonna say you can't have too much lube. You kind of can, but it depends on the kind of lube too. That makes a difference. But man, once I got over that and started to be like, oh no, this is nothing to do with me and nothing to do with her, as far as like we're not doing this right. This is actually just helping us do it better. And the same thing for women. I think it's really healing for women, because then they don't have to be self-conscious in their head. Oh, I'm not wet. Like he's not, thinks that I'm not attracted to him, blah, blah, blah. It's like, fuck, so much of this unsaid stuff. And it's like, let's just use these amazing tools we have at our disposal.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I think actually what you just said there, that will probably be helpful for a lot of people to understand that and to take off that kind of that feeling of taking it personally, which I think a lot of people can do. It's really important. You mentioned tantra before, seeing as we're on the topic of sex. For people that don't understand tantra, because I know tantra is more than just sex, but you said that transferred over into your regular life more than what doing like the kind of self-help did transfer into your sex life. So I
Yep.
wanted to touch on that a little.
Yeah, it's funny. Tantra is such a, it's like a buzzword. I always think of, it's one of the American pies where
Finch,
But Finch,
verified too.
yes. He's like, oh, he's practicing for Stifler's mom. It's like, oh, I remember that was the first time I think I was ever exposed to this idea of Tantra. As probably a lot of young men in our generation. I'm 35 also. So it's like we're in that same age range. Uh, but Tantra is not inherently, doesn't inherently have anything to do with sex. There's like tantric sex and like, but the practice of tantra and what that can look like, it can be quite elusive, and it's always a fun thing to try and talk about it in a few minutes, because it's something that needs to be felt and experienced many times before it then becomes some level of second nature. Very simply put, it's presence. It's being radically present. It's being present in the sense of like curious, like I've never seen this before. Like when I'm with a woman, oh my goodness, like you are the most interesting thing I've ever seen. Not just taking for granted that you are a woman. Like when I'm starting to get intimate with her, or if I'm just connecting with a human, I'm looking at you, I'm being with you, and doing my best to release whatever preconceived notions, judgments, beliefs, all that shit that will inevitably come up that will then try and tell me a story of who you are and how I feel about you. What if I released all that and was just here in this moment with every nuance that's taking place? That is an expression of Tantra. It's breathing, because breathing can help with that. If I take deep breaths, it can help me come back to the present moment much more. And in sex, that foundation is everything. Everything else, the bells and whistles, the chains and whips, the dildos, the lube, those are great. Those are just cherries on top. The foundation of having that deep radical presence in that tantra, if you want to call it that, it's the breathing, it's the eye gazing, it's like seeing into each other's souls, it's being curious and present and not making any assumptions. So that would be like my down and dirty way of describing how I experience and what I believe it to be.
Yeah, I guess it seems almost like a practice of experiencing the depth of life in the moment, and
Ooh,
then
that's good.
experiencing that depth of life intimately with your partner as well, sexually.
Well said.
Yeah, incredible. Brother, I'm aware of the time and it's flown by. Thank you so much for being here. For people that would like to find you, I'll put the links in the show notes, but where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, Jordan Bowditch on Instagram. That's where I play mostly. Jordan, last name Bowditch, Bowditch, Bowditch. And thank you for having me, man. This is a lot of fun. Like, I do podcasts here and there, and I just never know what it's going to be like. And it feels really good to connect with a brother and to just have a free flowing conversation. This has been great.
Appreciate that, man. I feel like I'm making my way through the Austin community. I feel like I'm becoming an honorary member from the UK
Nice.
at the moment.
You be careful, man. You might move here. Everybody's
Oh,
doing
well,
it.
I know, right? I know. But yeah, man. Hey, brother, thanks so much once again.
Yeah.